Are you ready? Ready to bring a revolution to your relationships? Ready for the experiences on your dating adventure to evolve? Ready for more passion, intimacy, connection, and love in your relationship? Ready to heal past relationship wounds? You're in the right place. I'm Alan, the love engineer, and this is the Relationship Revolutions podcast. In this series, you'll get guidance and tips from me, interviews from other relationship experts, insights from couples who already have a great relationship, and other mind-opening conversations. G'day, and welcome to the latest episode of Relationship Revolutions, where this week I am joined by Crunch Rajani, who I'm not going to tell a story. I'm going to let her tell it herself. But before we get into this, Crunch, how are you and where are you?
I am doing well today. And I am currently in the traditional lands of the Orang Laut people, which has been colonized as Singapore.
I've never heard it called that before. But obviously heard of Singapore, but not necessarily the origins.
Well, I mean, we don't often talk about like the colonial origins of most of the lands that we now inhabit as something else, right? So, but I think it's important to acknowledge that
this
this
is true.
used to be somebody else's, and it was taken away from them. So,
yeah, that's where most of the British Empire came from. We have a flag, so we're going to take your country. Don't agree with that, but anyway. History is what it is, and we cannot change it.
It is. We can do better going forward.
We certainly can. Yeah, I think the idea is to learn from history so you don't make the same mistakes again, but that doesn't seem to happen a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, just speaking from my own life there. And I've made several mistakes time and time again. So we're going to be talking about relationships today. And when we chatted briefly the other day, you mentioned a very interesting relationship you had through the COVID times. But I'm just curious as to what happened leading up to that point.
That's an interesting question. What do you mean by that?
You kind of moved quite quickly with that one. So I'm guessing that was a kind of a new approach for you. And you also mentioned something about you don't do relationships.
Yeah, so a bit of context, right? I am a digital nomad, or like what people would call a digital nomad, right? So I move fairly frequently, I travel a lot, and my lifestyle doesn't really lend itself to a typical relationship. I'm using air quotes here. Like the traditional sort of cisgender, heterosexual kind of partnered family or nucleus where, like you get together and then you live in a house in one fixed location and you end up having kids and a dog and whatever and all of those frills and attachments that come with that. So like my lifestyle, because I enjoy travel a lot and I have made this my lifestyle, like I'm usually not in one place for very long, might be a couple of months. And so for most people who don't have this lifestyle, it can be quite a strange kind of relationship to enter into, knowing that I either will not be there with them all the time, or they will have to like pack their bags and like go with me. And I'm not saying that like the lifestyle that I live is perfect or that it is for everyone, but it is the choice that I've made and I enjoy my lifestyle as it is. So for me to find a partner who is willing to come along on all my harebrained adventures has been quite a challenge, right? Like I have dated many people, but ultimately most of the time it has ended principally because they were not willing to come with me, so
Yeah. That makes sense, because the other day, sort of what's she got against relationships? Do they scare her, or what's going on? So
Well, that
little
too,
things like
right?
that often catch my attention.
Also, relationships are very, very scary, I think. It does require a level of vulnerability and trust and openness. And these are things that I'm working on with my therapist. And probably this isn't maybe the best place to work through like all of those issues. But some part of it was, what you mentioned, right? Like, what do I have against relationships? Like, I'm not a huge fan because like I haven't seen positive relationships modeled for me in my life growing up, right? So for me, it was never
Yeah,
like a big deal to kind of find somebody to be attached to for like the rest of my life, right? So for me, it wasn't really a kind of need or necessity or even like a goal in my life. I kind of like let it happen if it happened. And for the most part, I was quite content just, enjoying being in relationship with people without necessarily being in a relationship, if you get the
yeah.
distinction.
Yes, I do indeed. Having been out traveling to various places myself, I do get where you're coming from. And one of the key things you mentioned there was having positive relationship role models when you're younger. And I think that's something a lot of people are not getting these days, especially as the first 7 years of a person's life programs the unconscious mind. So whatever relationship aspects they see in that time, that is what relationship means. What dad does is
Mhm.
that's the identity that child grows up with. What mum does is what the child grows up with. So having those positive, influential role models is a game changer for having a great relationship. Doesn't mean you can't have that great relationship if you didn't have that, because you can learn, which I sense you are doing.
Yeah. Also, I guess like I am inclined to kind of question what exactly it means to have positive relationship role models, right? Like it's not just the idyllic kind of happy couple that never argues kind of relationship, but rather like what I think of as like a positive relationship that I think even in those idyllic kind of home settings where there might be a couple that never fights, like I feel like that's not a positive kind of relationship because conflict
Yeah,
is a very important aspect of growing any relationship, right? Otherwise it stays stagnant and then
yeah,
there's no growth either part. And I think like navigating conflict or, in having discussions or being able to disagree without it meaning that you don't love each other, for example,
yeah,
is, I think, elements of a positive relationship that not many people would think of when they think about like a positive relationship. They would just think like, oh, if you didn't grow up in a home that had like divorced parents, then like that was a positive relationship that you saw, right? Like my parents are still married today, but they fight a lot, right? And they
yeah,
don't fight well, so I have realized now in my adulthood that that was not a positive, relationship. And like maybe someone who grew up with divorced or separated parents might have had a better experience of what it means to have a good relationship with someone
yeah,
or a positive relationship with someone if they had open communication or they have tools to navigate conflicts or disagreements, right, in a healthy way that doesn't hurt anybody. There's no like resentment that breeds. And these are things that I am now learning.
yeah,
So it's been a road. It's been a journey.
yeah. All these things like dealing with conflict and being able to see another person's perspective and not judging whether they're right or wrong, and all these kind of things that we don't get taught in school. Yet they still teach you how to dissect a frog, how to do algebra, and all these kind of things that I have never used. Not since I left school anyway.
My
School
life,
anyway.
but if somebody had told me like how to file your taxes, or like how to have a disagreement without it leading to the rupture of your relationship. Right? Like that would have been fantastic. I feel like those would be life skills we should be taught in school, but obviously school's not
Yeah.
designed for that.
No, it's designed to make good employees.
Exactly.
And interestingly, the Gottman Institute in America that have probably done more research into relationships and divorce than anyone else in the world. They said one of the key things they look out for is how couples deal with conflict and how they deal with disagreements. Because if they just argue about it, they'll probably end up in divorce. If they bury it and ignore it, they'll probably end up in divorce. Whereas if they actually talk it through and listen to each other's perspective and then find a way forward from there, even if they're not shouting at each other, it's very few of those couples actually end up in divorce.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So it does make me wonder why we don't get taught this stuff, even by, well, I would hazard a guess that parents don't teach us because they weren't taught themselves, so they don't know how to teach us. You can't teach what you don't know. And
And I think a lot of, I don't know, maybe our older generation folks, they don't even know that they don't have these tools, right? Because they
yeah,
didn't see that model for them. And I don't know, but I felt personally that people in my community, in the elder generation, are kind of resistant to learning new things, or like to being told that, like, oh, hey, like how you've been doing your relationships is not fantastic and there's a better way to do it. They're not very receptive to that. So,
yeah.
so yeah.
Now, I don't know what it's like in Singapore, but certainly over here, when my parents grew up, if they stepped out of line, certainly in school, they'd get caned, they get a slipper across the backside and whatever else. So they are conditioned to obey and not make any changes, which I think will have an influence on them when younger generations say, well, actually, if you try doing it like this, it's not going to be well received. Plus, in that generation, it was
Yeah.
children should be seen and not heard.
Yes, I remember that. In my family, it was pretty similar. So
Yeah.
I can relate.
So, shall we talk a little bit about this COVID relationship you had? How did you meet him?
Okay. Fun story. So it was in 2019 that I met him. I was traveling around in Mexico, and I was staying in a hostel, and I met him at the hostel that we were staying at. He is Mexican, and he was also traveling around Mexico. And he, like, we got along great because, you know, we were talking, and like we became friends. And because we were traveling both on separate journeys, we crossed paths again in several other cities, and he invited me to visit him in his city that I had not been to, that I never even heard of. And I was kind of resistant to going because it didn't fit into my plans of like what I wanted to do in Mexico. But eventually, towards the end of my trip, I had about 10 days that was unaccounted for. I had no real plans or anything to do. So I was like, okay, I'll just go drop by and see what's going on in this city that he has, you know, built up to be like a really cool city and blah, blah. So I went to hang out with him, and I don't know if you've heard of the app called Couchsurfing, but so I stayed with him via Couchsurfing, which is a way for like travelers and hosts to kind of interact and like exchange cultural experiences. So that was fun. I got a little glimpse into what life in Mexico was like for him, and you know, like he took me to visit his parents' home in some small village. Like it's really a village of like 300 people. And you know, it was fun. It was a fun experience. And after that, like we were still friends, and I left because I had things to do, plans to to carry out and, places to be. So I left, and eventually I went to Europe, and we stayed in touch, right? Like via text and whatever, just casual text messages. And one day when I was in Europe, I got a message from him saying like, hey, do you want to go to Turkey? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, do I want to go to Turkey? What are you talking about? And he said like, oh, I want to go to Turkey, and I don't know anybody else who would possibly be interested in a last minute impromptu trip like this. And you're the only person that I know who does travel, and I know you're in Europe. So like, Turkey's not that far away. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's true. Turkey's not that far away. And I hadn't been to Turkey before. So it seemed like a sensible thing to do, right? Like I'm always up for like exploring new places. So like, okay, I'll go to Turkey and like we'll meet there. So I met him in Turkey, and like after 2 days, he was like, actually, I'm interested in you. Do you want to be my girlfriend? And I was like, no, this is never gonna work because I'm heading back to Singapore after this, and you're heading back to Mexico, and like long distance is just dumb. Because I mean, it's just very difficult. Like I'd had other experiences with long distance relationships, and it's such a challenge, honestly. But so we left it at that, kind of whatever. And he was going back to Mexico in 10 days anyways, but then he left and he missed his flight. So he ended up changing it and, spending an extra 2 weeks in Turkey with me. And in that time, because we were basically together all the time, and like we traveled. And I think travel is a very good test of like whether you would be a good couple.
Yeah.
Because it's honestly like you have to navigate all kinds of decisions, right? Like that you would normally not have to make in your life, about like where you're going to go next, like how to navigate this foreign country that neither of you is familiar with, right? And to also like enjoy each other's company through that whole month of being together. Like I guess eventually I decided that like, okay, so maybe this thing might work. Like we seem to get along really well. So, okay, we'll try it out. And I still was going back to Singapore. So I said like, okay, we'll meet back up in a couple of months and, take it from there and see what happens. But then I went back to Singapore and like they closed the borders because COVID. So I ended up doing a long distance kind of relationship for 8 months, I want to say. And eventually it just made no sense to keep going on because, going on in the long distance relationship because it didn't seem like they were going to open borders up again, right? So for me, it just kind of made sense for me to fly to Mexico and see whether we would still get along in person. Traveling together is one thing, but like actually doing life together is a different thing, right? And so I flew to Mexico and like moved in with him, or like we moved to a new place together, and things were going well and things were going all along. And so that turned out to be like a 3.5 year relationship, which ended about 6 months ago.
Okay, so during those 8 months in Singapore with the long distance thing, how often were you actually communicating? Was it every day or just once a week?
We would text every day, like for a few hours, because the time difference made it very, very difficult. It was like a 13-hour or 14-hour time difference. So that's really hard to navigate. Like we literally had like a couple of hours like before either of us went to bed, right? So that was tough. So we texted a lot and did video calls. We would do like co-working calls where I would be doing my work and he would be doing his work, and we would just hang out like, and we would try to video call, I don't know, maybe like once a week. I don't even remember, honestly, because it was a while ago, but somehow it worked, I guess.
Yeah. So when you were living with him in Mexico, and at that time you didn't have much of a choice as to whether you stay there or whether you do what you normally do and just, okay, I've been here a couple of weeks, I'm going now, bye, and carry on with the travels. That option wasn't there. So would you have stayed so long if it was?
I would say that the option was still there because Mexico during COVID was still open. Like everybody else was closed, but Mexico was kind of relaxed in terms of like their precautions or the rules that they had implemented in light of COVID. So you could still travel inside Mexico.
Yeah.
Probably like going into a different country would have been difficult, but Mexico is a huge country. There are like tons of places, tons of cities. So I could have left to go somewhere else if I felt that it wasn't working out. But I did feel like it was working out and that it was going well for the most part. Like I did feel like I was lonely because he was the only person that I knew. And because of COVID, it was difficult to meet people who, like in a social setting, right? Like there
Yeah.
were no yoga classes or no, community events or anything like that. So that was difficult. But in our relationship, I thought that things were going quite well. And, we were getting along well, considering the fact that we were mostly indoors. I mean, we went on hikes and stuff, and we traveled a bit during that time. But yeah, we got along pretty well because we have a lot of shared interests.
Yeah. So what I'm sensing is towards the end of that relationship, you felt like he was more of a friend than somebody to share the rest of your life with, whether it's stuck in a box or exploring the world.
That's an interesting statement. It might be accurate. I think our relationship did kind of become something to like towards like it did kind of like taper down or like taper off, where we did start becoming more friendly rather than romantically involved in that sense. But I didn't initiate the breakup, he did, although I was ultimately glad that it happened. But what was I guess, so yeah, that we were growing apart in some ways, and it wasn't the same as when it first started in terms of the relationship, right? Like that intensity or that passion, so to speak, was no longer as burning as bright or whatever. So it had kind of simmered down a little bit, and also he wanted to explore other forms of being in a relationship with people. So he wanted to have that freedom to kind of, I don't know, figure things out for himself about what he wanted from a relationship and what he how he saw himself in relation to other people, and exploring other ways of relating with people that are not solely romantic or not in a sense of possessing a person. Because
Yeah.
I think, and I totally like get where he was coming from. And I think I was in his same mindset like 3 years at the start of our relationship. Like when I said like, no, this is never gonna work, I was also in that mindset of like, I want to have fun and like be in relationship with other people and like not just confine myself to one person. And he eventually got there like 3 years later when I had changed my mindset into something completely different. But he raised a point that I have always felt is quite true, but he kind of gave me some language around speaking about it, in the sense that we often look at romantic relationships as something quite possessive, right? Like you don't think of them, I don't know, it's a very weird thing because this happens only with romantic relationships and not with any other relationships. Like nobody complains that your family has 8 members and you love them all equally. Right? Like nobody's gonna say like you love your mom, you can't love your dad as much, or like you have 3 siblings, like you can't love them all as much. But when it comes to like a romantic relationship, somehow there is this expectation that there is only one person that you reserve this type of affection or care for, which is kind of strange, and it is kind of like a very possessive kind of relationship, right? Like they belong to you and you belong to them. And I mean, Taylor Swift's song, You Belong, whatever. I don't know. I don't even know what the name of the song is, but there's a very popular Taylor Swift song about this very thing, right? And the reason why people resonate so much with that is because that's the idea that we've been all told since we were little, right? And it's a thing that we've been all, immersed in for the last 100 years or so. But I don't think it's maybe natural. I mean, why do we have these rules about romantic relationships, right? I'm not saying that like if that's what works for you, then you shouldn't do that. But I also think that sometimes we are unnecessarily constrained by these kind of structures that are in place that make sense, using air quotes, only within the context of a, two-person heterosexual cisgender relationship, right? So I don't know where I was going with that, but I think that's kind of something that, caused the end of our relationship because I had become more possessive and he didn't want me to be. And I don't know, I somehow through the years of our relationship got more and more possessive, although at the outset I was the one who was like, no, don't control me, like I'm gonna go. And like I even remember telling him like, no, we can't be in a relationship, like I want to have a relationship with everybody else, but like, if you want to give this a try, like when we are in the same city together, then we can be in a relationship, and when I'm not there or when we're not together, then like we can both be free to do whatever we want. Right? And that was kind of like what I started off saying I wanted, and then eventually like things changed along the course of our relationship because we never really explored that avenue of it.
Yeah, what comes up for me is a couple of things, actually. One is, how do you actually define love? Because whoever you ask, they're going to come up with a different answer. And I do think Walt Disney's got a lot to answer for. Like you meet this amazing prince or princess, and then you get married and you live happily ever after. None of those movies say anything about how to make that happily ever after happen. Don't show anything about building a strong relationship. But on top of that, there's also this attachment, which a lot of people mistake for love, which is that possessive thing. And when you get attached to somebody, it's almost like there's another side of you, a little bit like Gollum and Smeagol in The Lord of the Rings, where
right.
I can't remember which one's which now, but the one side of him is just like nice, friendly, supportive, serving, and the other one's my precious, you're mine. And I think a lot of people get a little bit like that in relationship as well. And it comes from that place of fear of loss as much as anything else, and fear of rejection, which goes back to when we were cave dwellers out in the savannah or wherever else, where you needed that community or the tribe to survive. And part of our brain is still programmed the same way. So we lose that partner, especially when you're in a different country and you've got no other tribe, that's going to play a part in it, as is the natural hormones of oxytocin and whatever else. When you hug and you spend that intimate time and vulnerability and everything else, you're going to be getting attached and closer and closer. But then from the male perspective, when we feel like we're being boxed in, we're like, I've got to escape, I've got to be free. And it's finding that balance between the two.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, but somehow that doesn't kind of play out as much, for example, in relationships with friends, right? Like your best friend's not going to be mad because you hugged somebody else, but your partner might be. Right? Like I don't honestly, like that is something that is quite surprising to me. And um it is something that I've been reflecting on and thinking about, like, why don't we have such high standards, air quotes, for other kind of relationships, and why is it that the romantic relationship is placed on such a pedestal? And I think what also like contributes to a little bit of the problem is that we expect this one person to fulfill every single need that we have, right? And that is, dooming the relationship to failure from the very start, right? I think if you look at people with healthy relationships with their spouse or their partner, they also have very healthy relationships with a lot of other people
Yeah.
around them, right? Whether that's their family or their friends or like other people, their colleagues, so on and so forth. They have not kind of placed all of their needs on this one person, because that is, I mean, it's a lot to carry, right? Like
Yeah.
to be that one person for another person. Like I can barely even be that for myself. Like I can't do that for a whole other human being, right? So I think that's also part of the problem, right? That we're told, that we're incomplete without our other half, or, like you need to be like the yin and yang, and like you complete each other, and all kinds of nonsense. But I really think that we're more like trees in a forest, maybe, right? That we need all the trees to, I don't know if you've seen like the new research that's come out about like how trees kind of contribute to the healing of a sick tree in a forest, right?
Yeah.
Like the other trees around them kind of like send the nutrients through the earth. And like scientists are just beginning to understand this. But if we think about ourselves as trees in a forest, and our well-being is dependent on the well-being of the trees around us, then we stop being parasitic, right? Like we're not that fungus that grows on the tree and strangles it, but rather a whole group of trees that support all each other, and like we care for each other in community. And so that's, I think, kind of more of what I've been thinking about, exploring, and considering in, in light of the recent breakup, and like having had these conversations similarly with my now ex.
Yeah, I think the environment and community thing is very, very powerful, but in the current culture, it's very, very lacking. Because I remember when I grew up, there's lots of different things that people did as a community together. But now everyone's sort of disconnected, not only from themselves, but from each other. So they live separately, sometimes even within the same house, and work away from where you live, long hours. So you get up in the morning, you take the kids off to preschool, and go to work for the day, pick the kids up from preschool, put them to bed, and sit down and watch TV instead of communicating, and then go to bed and repeat it for 5 to 7 days a week. We wonder why we feel lonely and disconnected, and we look to that intimate partner to be the whole community, because the culture's not set up as a tribe anymore. Like over the last, I don't know how many years, so many things for men, like working men's clubs closed or got to allow women, and vice versa for the women. There's so many things, like women would go off and do their thing, get a break from the kids, get a break from the husband. Men would go and talk to their guys, because that's just what they do and that's what they need. But we're not actually looking at the whole picture. It's just like the nucleus of my family is my tribe, rather than my family being part of a bigger tribe.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I recently wrote my reflections on this topic, more or less, in my Substack, where I kind of explored why we've reached this point where the family nucleus has become, or like the immediate family nucleus has become kind of your tribe, like you say, right? That like we are no longer depending on other people around us to support us or to care for us in times of need, right? Like even when, for example, you fall sick and you need like a cup of soup so that you can recover, right? Like you don't want to be cooking your own soup. Oftentimes you like, maybe in the past, like you would have called your neighbor to say like, hey, I'm feeling really poorly, please bring me some soup, right? And you would return the favor when they are feeling sick, right? But nowadays, like you wouldn't do that. You would call Grab, like you would call Uber Eats or something and get some sort of food delivered to your house, right? So like that community aspect has been removed, and I think a lot of the blame can be placed on capitalism that has a lot to benefit from us living in these isolated silos where we are no longer connected with each other, right? So in my article, like kind of like put forth this idea that I had seen in someone's Instagram video or TikTok or something, where they talked about like a lawnmower, right? Like nowadays it's very common for everybody to have a lawnmower in their home, and it doesn't make any sense because you use it like once a week or once every 2 weeks. What if you shared that lawnmower with 5 other families, right? Like if you were all a community, you could do that. You could, like it would be a feasible idea that like all get together, pool your money, buy one lawnmower, and like on Monday you have it, on Tuesday the next guy has it, Wednesday like the next person, and so on and so forth, and you just take it in rotation, and you just have one lawnmower that you share amongst the 5 of you. But that's not good business for capitalism. They only sell one lawnmower instead of 5 lawnmowers, which is why they've promoted the idea of this family nucleus being the smallest unit of, of community, right? That you feel like your family is very different from the family that lives right next door to you. And you feel like you can't ask them for their lawnmower and trade your, I don't know, your leaf blower for in exchange, whatever. Like when you feel that you are separate, that's when, capitalists make more money because they can sell you more shit, because you feel like you don't belong together. You're not part of the same family, So I think that's a lot of it, right? Like, and why we've ended up with these situations of people dealing with ever more isolation and and not having any sort of community around them, and things that you mentioned, right? Like the long commute, working away from home, and television, and all of these, they kind of just drive us into not being able to have time, energy, resources, and space to gather with people who could hold us up and care for us. So it's sad.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also interesting when you sort of think, well, as you mentioned, like Uber Eats or Just Eats and all those kind of things. So you can stay at home, you can work from home, you can have your food delivered, and you don't actually need to leave anywhere because someone else is taking care of you. And what scares me is when you look at that picture of a human being, and then you look at a cow that's on a farm. The farmer brings the food to him, the farmer provides the occupation and everything else, and there's very little difference between the two. It's almost like thinking for yourself is
Yeah.
no longer allowed.
I mean, it's bad for business.
But then on the flip side, communism and socialism aren't necessarily good for business either. They're not good for everyone, because if you think, when you play a game of Monopoly, everyone starts off equal. But what happens in the end?
It's luck of the draw.
Maybe.
It's interesting that you bring up Monopoly. I read an article or a commentary about how Monopoly was initially created by the I don't know, whoever created Monopoly, designed it as a game to show that, you might all start off equal in some sense, but through acquiring property or by, certain actions that you take, the people who have money just end up having more and more money, and eventually they control the entire board, which is when the game ends, right? Like nobody else has any money. And if you happen to, I don't know, have a couple of unlucky rolls of the die, you end up in a position where it's impossible for you to get out of the situation, right? And they meant it as like a social commentary that like the system is designed for you to, for one person to take control of everybody's money, right? And there's no way out of it. and yet we still play this game and we think that it's great that one person has a chance to become filthy rich
The
while
only
everybody
way
else
you can sort of get out of that in the game is to sort of say, well, I'm going to buy this lot, you buy that lot, and we'll work together as a team. And then at the end of once we've all been round, we'll split the money up between us, kind of thing. And even that's limited as to how well it can work out. And something else that came up for me, you've ever read Robert Kiyosaki's books or played his game?
and bring
Yeah, he wrote a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad initially. And
right. I
he
haven't
said
played any of
when he started making money in the real estate business, he basically did what he learned in playing Monopoly. Buy houses, turn them into a hotel kind of thing, and expand from there. But what he did, he also created a game which he called Cash Flow. And in that game, you start off running around in a rat race. But the aim of the game is to get out of the rat race and to live a better life, if you like. And if certain places, a little bit like Monopoly has chance and community chest, if you land on certain things, you get a doodad card, which would be, oh, you've bought a boat. So that takes a certain amount of money off you, makes it harder for you to escape the rat race. And you look at how we are living today, and it's exactly what happens. We're stuck in a rat race because we've been conditioned to buy all of these things that we don't need to impress people we don't even know. Crazy.
Because I think like the fundamental lack is time, right? Like that we are forced, most of us, to work bullshit jobs. I don't know if you've read that book by David Graeber. I think that's his name. I might be saying it incorrectly, but he wrote this book called Bullshit Jobs that kind of postulates that about 80% of the jobs, I might be making this statistic up, but like about 80% of the jobs that we have currently are all bullshit. They don't contribute in any useful or real way to the betterment of anybody, right? Like the guy who writes the report about the thing that went wrong or whatever, like, and managers who manage managers. Most of us do jobs that, as COVID showed us, like we can stop doing for basically about a year and a half, and nothing has changed. Like we didn't go to work. We spent our time baking sourdough cookies and, I don't know, learning to crochet and whatever else that people took up during COVID, and nothing happened. Like nobody died. I mean, apart from the situation outside of that, but nobody died because these people didn't go to work, right? Like they were at home because them going to work was much worse, right? So I think it's a sign that a lot of us are stuck in having to trade our time, which is our most important and valuable resource, and most limited as well, right? Like we can't do anything to get back any of the time that we've already passed, that's already passed us by, right? And yet we are still stuck working 8-hour days, giving that labor, giving that time to somebody who is using it to benefit themselves much more than they are ever going to give us, right? Like if your job gets your company like a $2 million deal and you get paid $100,000, that 190,000, my math is like really bad, but like that 900 and I don't know, that $1 million+ that you created in wealth for the company doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the company, right? Like that's a loss for you, right? That money should have come to you, or like a larger percentage than $100,000 of that $2 million deal should have come to you, but it doesn't. And for a lot of us, this is true, right? And I think what you said, that we end up buying things that we don't want to impress people who don't care or we don't know, is true, but we have to find some way to find fulfillment, because we are denied the time of having we're denied the ability to have the time to do things that actually fulfill us, right? So we have to turn to what marketing tells us will fulfill us. Buy this car, you're gonna feel cool. Buy this boat, you're gonna impress the hot chick so that you can, finally have a cool, like a beautiful girlfriend, whatever, right? And yet, like, it doesn't help. Right, what we actually do need is to get out of our jobs and actually go and bake sourdough bread and crochet or whatever, because I think, despite the fact that lots of people were trapped in their homes and couldn't leave, I think people did reconnect with hobbies and like things that they were interested in that they didn't have time to do. Like, so many people started growing plants, and I'm sure like plants are much more positive addition to their lives than another ROI report or another profit and loss statement.
Definitely.
So.
And I think that having conversations like this is very important, because if you've got one person like yourself, that you mentioned in the beginning, loves traveling, digital nomad, and then someone that just wants to stay in that one place, do the same thing every day for 50 odd years, it's not going to gel well for the long term. Yet when you look at what people put on dating profiles these days, other than the ones that can't be bothered with anything, so they just put "ask me," and it's like talking about they've got to have the same taste in movies. Well, you can have the same taste in movies, but the lifestyles have got to match up in some way. Otherwise, why are you doing it?
And I think more than just lifestyles, it's also the values, right? Like,
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously, one of my very important values is freedom, which I have created for myself by choosing to travel, by choosing not to have a steady 9-to-5 job, by venturing into entrepreneurship and starting my own business, because I couldn't get that freedom from, the traditional life path that most people take, right? So if you don't match on values, then I think the relationship is kind of doomed from the start, right? Like, it might not seem that way. Like, you might have the same taste in movies, or you might, enjoy the same kind of music or whatever, right? Like superficial things, right? And ultimately, like, if your values don't match, like if you want to have kids and I don't want to have kids, I'm like, that's not gonna work out. I'm sorry, right? But I think those are kind of bigger conversations that people find difficult to have. Like, nobody wants to talk about how much money they're making and how they intend to spend it on like a first or second date. And when it comes up, it's usually too late.
Yeah, very much so.
But it's like, oh crap, whoops, this is, or like, you've already invested like months of getting to know them and being in a relationship with them, and then you realize like, oh no, this person spends money like water, and my, one of my values is like stability, and that means saving for my future or putting money aside for retirement, and this person has barely $20 in their bank account. Like, if they got into a medical situation tomorrow, they couldn't pay for that, right? So yeah, lifestyle and values, I think we should put those on dating apps.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of the big topics that we're almost conditioned not to talk about, like sex, politics, money, religion, and all of these things. So we don't talk about them. We almost get to the point where we believe that everyone else will think the same way and feel the same way, which they don't. So if you don't talk about those things, you don't talk about your values, you don't talk about boundaries either, And then when it's too late, after you've crossed somebody's boundary or had a disagreement over values, then it's like, now what? Oh, we've just ended the relationship, throw it away. Instead of, okay, well, maybe we should have talked about this earlier. This is what I believe. How about you? And actually have those conversations. But it's like, also, who's going to fulfill what role within the relationship? It's even more so if there's children going to be coming along. What does this look like for you in the future? It doesn't have to be set in stone, but if you've not had the conversation at all, it's a recipe for disaster.
Right. I mean, something else they should teach us in school, right? How to date.
That's why I'm here. Yeah, they teach you to talk, but they don't teach you to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
They teach you how to add up, but they don't teach you how to manage your cash flow.
Mm-hmm. Or even what a cash flow is.
Yeah. Here's how hire purchase works. So you can buy stuff you can't afford.
Right. I mean, that keeps you trapped in a cycle of debt so that you have to go to work and fill the factories and work in a bullshit job that, I mean, it all feeds into the cycle, right? Like not teaching us these things in school creates a population that is disempowered and unable to make decisions for themselves about how they want their lives to be, right? If people didn't believe that they needed a big house to feel complete, or fancy car to feel like they're worthy, or a shiny diamond ring to feel like they're loved, they wouldn't pursue those things. Yet they do, because we're not taught otherwise.
Yeah.
We're not taught that you don't get fulfillment or satisfaction from any of these things, or chasing any of these things, because I don't know if it's happened to you, but like for most of us, when you buy something, the happiness lasts like a few seconds, a few minutes, maybe a couple of hours, and then after that you're just back to having that deep sense of dissatisfaction and like something's missing, right? And that, I guess, eventually, like, you have to make the realization that all of these things that you're chasing outside of you don't actually exist externally. They come from within, right? Like, and whether that is a material thing that you're chasing, like a car, a house, or a boat, or a shiny ring, or in a partner, right? Like, or in a romantic partner, right? Like, a lot of people think that, like, oh, I feel so miserable, it must be because I don't have a boyfriend, right? My friend, if you feel miserable without a boyfriend, you're going to be miserable with a boyfriend. Just have like a whole other human to deal with also, so yeah, this is what we've been told by society, because it boosts the economy, right? And that's what they want us to keep doing. So
it's like, I want a new I want to have a partner to make me feel happy. Well, what are they going to do to make you feel happy? Because that feeling is generated within you. So why give that power to someone else? That person made me angry. Well, that anger was generated within you. So what is it that's actually creating that anger in the first place? It's all sort of looking for external solutions to fix an internal problem.
Yeah, and
nobody
obviously,
wants
like,
to hear
I
that.
get why, right? It is very hard to say, like, oh, okay, like, this is something that I have to fix about myself, because obviously, like, that means admitting that you're flawed, that you're not perfect, and we want to all be perfect, and we all want to be unflawed, and always correct, and admitting that you're wrong, or admitting that you screwed up or made a mistake is really hard, and admitting that you don't know, and that you need, and that there's room for growth is really hard, right? And a lot of people don't want to do that. Unfortunately, that's what needs to be done. Right? Like you said, like, all of our feelings come from us, right? Like, you can't say that, like, my water bottle made me mad. Like, why would you say that somebody made you mad? Because that anger comes from within, like you said. So it's hard.
All part of the human experience. We're here to learn and grow and contribute as well. Not take,
Mhm.
take, take, take. So, as this podcast is called Relationship Revolutions, I have a question for you. What is if there was one thing that you believe could bring a revolution to the world of dating and relationships, what would that one thing be?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I guess if more people stopped viewing romantic relationships as the end all be all, or placing that kind of relationship on a pedestal that's higher than every other kind of relationship. I think like romantic or intimate relationships in that sense are important, but so are all the other relationships that sustain us, right? And a lot of us don't somehow prioritize other relationships. I mean, we've all had that friend who, got a boyfriend or got a girlfriend and just disappeared off the face of the earth, and only to appear again 6 months later saying like, oh, we broke up. Right? Like, why do we do this? And how can we not? Right? Like, the only way to do that is to stop prioritizing romantic relationships as higher than everything else, so that we value all relationships at the same level and treat them with the respect and care that they deserve and nurture them, even in times, and there may be seasons, right? Like in seasons, you want to focus more on your family relationships, sometimes on your friends, sometimes on your romantic partner. But it can't always be one thing is always higher than the others, because you can't just let the other relationships languish while one flourishes. We need all of these relationships to sustain us.
Yeah.
So I think that would really cause a revolution in the dating world if we stopped viewing one person as being the answer to all of our prayers.
Yeah, very powerful, that one. As one of the things that I realized when I had kids, and up until that point, yeah, I did have that belief that I can only love one person at a time. And then I've got twins, so there's these two little things like, if I can only love one person at a time, that means I've got to choose between you every day. It's like, no, that's not happening.
Exactly. I think the human capacity for love is quite magical because, as you said, like being a parent might be the most obvious representation of that. They always say that like a mother's love doesn't get split among her children, it just grows to expand and accommodate all of her children, right? And I think like that's the same for any parent. And I think that's the same for any kind of human being who has the capacity to love, which is all of us, right? That we can expand our capacity to love depending on how many people we want to love, right? And if you choose to only keep your love for one person, then that's your choice. But you can also choose to simply expand the amount of love that you have to give. And it's infinite, right? Like there's no limit on how much love you can have, as people with multiple children have proven. Like it comes from a source that doesn't have an end, so
Beautiful. So, as a digital nomad, what is your line of business?
I am a transformational travel coach, and I support people, particularly women, who are navigating transitions in life transitions through the vessel of travel. Because I feel that for me personally, like I've been traveling for the last 10 years, and travel has always been there to sustain me, regardless of what's going on in my life, right? And I always find that for me, when I travel, I get more clarity, I get more confidence, I get more independence. I tune into myself, I tap into my self-trust. And I find that for women especially, like these are things that we're lacking, and travel can be a great way for you to reconnect with that, especially in the moment of going through a life change, right? Like whether that's a divorce or a breakup, or like a career change, or maybe your kids have left the nest and you're suddenly a parent with no children who to actively parent, and think at times like that, a lot of our identity is often tied to these roles that we fulfill for other people. right? Like I'm this person's partner, or I'm this person's parent, or I'm an accountant or whatever. And when that gets taken away from us, that can leave kind of like a vacuum or a hole that you need to fill up. And like, what better thing to fill it up with than yourself, right? And to reconnect with your own self so that you don't have to necessarily define yourself solely in relation to others and the roles that you play in their lives. So I think travel is a great medium for people, especially women, to kind of get away from their usual context of opinions, perspectives, and expectations that other people have of them, and just go do your own thing. you know and yet travel remains kind of scary and terrifying for most people, and as someone who has done it for 10 years, I mean, I can guide you through the process. So that's what I do.
And for a lot of people, I think it's just the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, it will always be an unknown unless you go out and get to know it. Right? And once you do it the
Yeah.
first time, I think it kind of gives you that sense of like, oh my God, I've done this thing that I thought was incredibly difficult and impossible for me. And that means I can do anything, right? Like a friend recently shared with me that her mom, who is turning 60 next year, recently went on an all girls trip. So it was just her and her friend, and she went on this trip organized for like female solo travelers of middle age, or like that age group. And she said that it was one of the most freeing times of her life, and she felt liberated that she could do anything because she went on this trip, and then she came back and she learned how to ride the bicycle. Now she's learning how to swim. I mean, like an old lady, like conservative old lady of like 60 years old, who traditionally would just be like, oh no, this is the end of like, I'm in my sunset years, I'm not going to try anything new. Like, she's found the courage and the motivation to try new things and do things that she's always wanted to, but she's just been like waiting around for her husband to be available. And she's just like, you know what, like, I can take trips on my own. I don't have to wait for my husband to retire so that we can do that together or anything, right? So it is so powerful, when you take that trip and you realize that really the world is your oyster, like, and whatever you want to do, like, the only person who's standing in your way is probably yourself.
Yeah. Or for some, the amount of cash in the wallet.
I mean, that's also something that you can, well, given that there are a lot of people who live within systems of oppression that do disempower them or like put them in positions where they don't have access to financial resources, yes, this is a valid concern. And there are ways around it. Like, I don't travel on a super large budget, and I think it's maybe a myth that has been, spread, that travel has to be expensive, but it really doesn't have to be. And also, I mean, you can travel within your own country. For most people, their country is not as small as Singapore. Right? And you can take a trip to a different city, and even that can be a liberating and freeing experience, and it doesn't have to cost a bomb.
Yeah.
There are ways to do it on a budget, right? So, I mean, if you can afford to buy a fancy ring for your partner, your spouse, or whatever, probably you can afford to take a trip too.
Yeah, it's all about what's most important at the end of the day, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about what you prioritize, right? You always find money for the things that you care about, right? I mean, if I asked you, like, do you want to spend $10,000 on buying a timeshare? I don't know if these still exist, but they were very popular at some point in the past, right? If you wanted to spend $10,000 on a timeshare, you might say like, no, no thanks, I don't have the money. But if I asked you if you needed to spend $10,000 on life-saving medical care for your child, you would say, I will find that $10,000 no matter what, right? So it's a matter of priorities and like what you value, right? So that's that.
Excellent. And if anyone's listening to this who might like to reach out to you, how's the best way to for them to get in touch with you?
You can check out my website, which is crunchranjani.com. You can connect with me on social media, Instagram as Crunch. I think if you type my name into Google or any other search bar, like, I will appear as one of the top 10 links. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, search Crunch Ranjani. And I also write a Substack about things that I care about. And that's crunchranjani.substack.com. So connect with me and let me know that you found me through this podcast, and I would be more than happy to chat.
Excellent. And I'll drop all the links and stuff in the show notes anyway. And it's been an honor and a pleasure chatting to you. And I'm sure we will
Likewise.
connect again at some point in the world, be it online, be it offline, and catch up again.
Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please leave me a review on your preferred podcast platform. Click the like button and also subscribe so that you get the new episode notifications. I'm curious, what did you take away from this episode? Please share your takeaways with me. Send me an email to relationship-revolutions@theloveengineer.rocks.